what's your name? We seem to be going the same way. So do you wanna join my one-man band? Do you wanna join me? Cause don't nobody seem to understand, and they all kinda noisy. Tell me where you've been since the time I realized.
Hello and welcome to Should You Watch, a Chatz television podcast where I, Alan, and my co-host Magellan tell you all about the new airing shows and whether or not you should add them to your queue. First of all, hi Magellan, what's going on, bud?
Hey, how you doing?
Happy August, happy post-August. We're kind of in what I would call the post-August months right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, the months after
how
August.
large of a swath is that?
It's about 11 months. You're post-August until you're at August again.
Huh.
Because, you know, August means like respected and impressive, so like you're post-respected. This joke is going nowhere. How are you? Just tell me, give me something. It's August. How was your August?
My August was good. You know, ironically, I spent a large chunk of it not here in Brooklyn, but the time that I spent in Brooklyn was lovely and great, and so happy that our August show was so full of my home because, you know, it's helped me feel like, yeah, this is my place after being abroad for a little while. But yeah, it was hot month, August, hot month. Woo!
Hot girl August, as they say. But yeah, anyways, that's very good to hear. I'm happy you're back, and we're talking about another TV show and telling people whether or not they should watch it. For what it's worth, I always forget to say how I'm doing. I'm doing all right. August
I was gonna ask. Sorry.
No, it's
How
all
are you
good.
doing?
It's all good. I didn't give you a segue, to be fair. I did give you a little motorcycle or a bicycle from Kareem's Bike Shop. That joke will make sense in about 30 minutes. My August was fine. It's been a little stressful as I've been apartment hunting. Otherwise, school starts in like a couple days. Oh my God, my final semester of grad school. That's all I got, guys. Business as usual. If you're not familiar, every month Magellan and I watch as much as we can, or as much as released of a currently airing television show. And we break it down by its pilot, different breakups in the middle of the series, and then the entire series. And we tell you whether or not it should go on your endlessly evolving and revolving queue of TV shows out there. Because there's so much TV. And who's here to sort through the chaff?
So much TV. Woo!
It's us. We're the Chatz people. We're here to sort through the chaff.
Chafts. Lincoln Chafee.
For August 2022, we watched Flatbush Misdemeanors on Showtime. Showtime, baby. It is a situational, dramatic comedy starring Kevin Iso and Dan Perlman as two young and down-on-their-luck Brooklynites trying to make it in this dang world. And it also follows the adventures of Dan's students, as Dan is a high school teacher in the Flatbush area of Brooklyn, and their interwoven family dramas, and Kevin's adventures as a struggling artist, as a young black artist in Brooklyn. So it's a modern-day kind of comedy. It is based on a short that the two of them worked on, I think, in 2017, 2018, that generated some Oscar buzz for a while as being a very realistic and accurate portrayal of the Flatbush area of Brooklyn, New York City. And, you know, they got to turn that into a full series with the help of a lot of different writers and directors. And it just finished airing its second season in August 2022. So that's why it made the cut for us. I want to start by asking Magellan, this was your pick this month. How did you hear about Flatbush Misdemeanors? What inspired you to pick it?
So I went, this was back in July. I went to a stand-up comedy show at the behest or the invite of roommate of the pod, Charlie. And one of the comics on the show, we went because David Cross was the headliner there, or like the kind of big, you know, featuring person. And I was intrigued to see David Cross do stand-up. But I think probably the funniest set of the night came from this guy, Napoleon Emile, who is in Flatbush Misdemeanors. He plays the guy who is Drew's friend, like the
Oh my God, the
very
gamer
kind of
guy?
stoic guy. Yeah,
He's the fucking best side character on the show.
he's
Wow.
really funny. His stand-up is so good. He basically does that same persona of like, yeah, kind of not. It's like not monotone, but it's like very steady tone, but very observant and tapped into like feelings in like a really funny way.
Weird, like strangely sensitive. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, so it was part of the mention of his credentials or his accolades or whatever when he was coming out. Like, oh, you've probably seen him on Flatbush Misdemeanors. And then I think Charlie was telling me afterwards that he'd heard good things about the show. And one of Charlie's friends who was there is a guy who's a public school teacher. And so we were both like, oh, yeah, or there's like a teacher in it or something. And so I came into it knowing that this guy was on it and he's really funny and that there's like New York City teaching happening. And I wanted to see that. Yeah. And I'm excited to talk about that as like an entry point into the show and the ways that that's like kind of what the show's about sometimes, but mostly not.
Yeah, right.
But overall, I had a really good time watching it, so I'm glad that I caught wind of it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I myself was not familiar with it or any of the talent involved. I think I know people who know Dan Perlman because he's in the like stand-up comedy scene in a big way. And there were a decent number of actors in this that I recognized, but I wasn't familiar with Kevin Iso's work. And there were very few people in this other than like occasional cameos that I was like, oh, that's somebody I know. And I liked that about it. It's kind of nice seeing what you could call relative unknowns because it makes it a lot easier to ground yourself and empathize with the characters as like regular people. And, you know, one of the main characters, Drew Hassan Johnson, the actor, was the one example where the whole time in season 1, I'm like, do I know this guy from something? And then we were talking about pre-pod. I'm like, oh my God, that's the guy from the Wire meme where he's like on the car. He's like, wow. And imagine that being one of the things you're most well known for. Now he's in this like well-regarded sitcom. So yeah, we watched both seasons. We watched all 20 episodes of the show, and we're here to talk about them. So to start, let's talk about the very first episode, which is called Leanin'. As our entry point into the series.
Yeah, so we're gonna break up this discussion. Normally in a Should You Watch episode, we have fewer episodes to discuss, so we can be a little more granular about chunks of episodes. In this one, we're gonna set up season 1 and sort of give you the recommendation of should you watch it or not, without spoiling anything for you. Then we're gonna spoil season 1. Then we'll do that same thing, set up season 2, and then spoil all of season 2.
Yeah.
So
sounds like a good plan.
Let's get into it.
So Leanin', I did not get a chance to watch, or I wasn't able to find actually the original Flatbush Misdemeanors short, but this very much felt like a short that was based on real people's lives. And right away, right out the gate, I was like so surprised at the textural accuracy of this show. Even having not lived in Flatbush, but having just like been around your neighborhood vaguely, I'm like, oh, this feels like I've seen some of these street signs
which
before.
I don't technically live in Flatbush, but I don't not live in Flatbush.
Yeah, I'm trying to say this without doxing you, but yes.
Yeah.
Well, we've been past these street signs before on walks around your area, and like we've been by stores like this, and we've seen stores like the Trinidadian bodega that Kevin works at in season 1, and you are a high school teacher, and so there was a lot of like, oh, this feels like little things that I've seen before, and where it becomes unique and where the show like tries to like differentiate itself is the form of accuracy, the version of accuracy that it depicts. Like, this is how students actually speak to each other, and it's what they're worried about. Because in this pilot, there isn't too much in terms of like big themes or like what is the show overall trying to be about. It's just like, here's some characters, here's some stuff that they're worried about. And one of the sort of key magic tricks that Flatbush Misdemeanors does, and especially in this first season, is it feels like everybody knows each other. And that's like one of the most Flatbushy things about it is, you know, your student's uncle is messing with your best friend who you know from middle school, and he works with this guy, and that guy knows this guy. Just like the web of characters, I think is like an immediate strength of the show that you kind of get a little taste of in the pilot.
Yeah.
What was your vibe check watching the first episode?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to love about this show. I think it's incredibly detailed in the way that you were describing, and as somebody who lives adjacent to the places that are depicted in the show, it felt recognizable to me. And also I felt rewarded for being someone who's lived in Brooklyn long enough to have seen certain things, like in one of the early episodes, they talk about the greenest block in Brooklyn contest. And like, I've seen signs that reference that contest before.
Oh, that's cool.
And that's like such a like local thing to, be like the plot of an episode. So it felt like a show that was created by people who have lived in this area of the city and have some love for it. And so I really liked that. And I think over the course of the 2 seasons, you see a variety of characters that flesh out that world, that also it feels like someone is trying to show you the range of people that they've seen or met in Brooklyn from inside Brooklyn, as opposed to, other depictions of New York City or of Brooklyn from more of an outside perspective that might show you more, I think, caricature type characters. And there's certainly characters like that in the show. But it feels like it's rare that a character is entirely shtick. And it's more often that it's like a fully realized person who's representing a very particular archetype, that is based in like a Brooklyn understanding of Brooklyn. Yeah. So for that reason, I really appreciated the show as someone who has lived here for, at least a few years. I can't pretend to be super deeply rooted in Brooklyn, but the parts that I did recognize were nice. And, the teaching part of it too, I think, to me, it's like, okay, I can tell that these are like adults playing teenagers. Like, there are certain ways that they're delivering certain lines that are like, what's up, my fellow teens?
Yes.
But for the most part, it's like whoever's writing this episode to episode clearly has a sense for the way that a classroom can feel, or the ways that, like you were saying, teenagers place their priorities or navigate the world. And I was surprised actually by how much of the show's like kind of protagonist time is given over to some of its teenage characters. That was a pleasant surprise. And I thought all that stuff was actually handled really well, and I wish they did more of that. So yeah, I think my overall vibe check was, it felt really good to live in this world. And I think they rendered a version of Brooklyn that is still like a TV show version. There are things that are heightened or things that are oversimplified here and there, but overall it feels like you're watching a show that's set in a real place through and through. And that's cool. And there are also like all these little background details, like anywhere that there's text in the background, it's a joke, and stuff like that is cool.
Yeah, clearly, especially in this pilot, a lot of attention was paid to like every frame being rendered with something, and even like Dan's like, whiteboard being dirty and like wiped off a lot. Like, it's a very well lived in space, and they have these like sets that they do a lot of good things with. But I think something that's worth noting is, like you mentioned, how every character feels like they matter a little bit. Like, even just in the context of this pilot, the way that we're introduced to the character of Drew is the inciting event that kind of like sets everything off is Kevin, Dan's best friend, is working as like an Uber Eats driver, and he delivers to this guy's apartment. And when he puts the food down on the kitchen table, he knocks over a bottle of promethazine cough syrup, aka lean, aka that purple drank, and spills a bunch of it down the sink, which leads him owing Drew a lot of money, hence the entire show starting, basically, the plot of it. And like and at that point you're just like, okay, Drew is like a horrible villain, bad person. And as the show progresses, you're like, oh, this is like a person. This is like a whole person with interiority who does things for a reason and acts the way that they do for a reason. And everybody in my life is like that, in a way the series is also kind of an exercise in like engendering empathy in people who I think society kind of puts to the side, like people who deal drugs and people who teach for like a very low wage and like teach inner city kids. Like these are people who we say, well, they're doing really good work, but we don't care about them. Or like starving artists, but like they matter, they have their own lives and their own dating trouble and more serious issues that crop up. And I just immediately fell in love with like how much the show wants you to care about individual people.
Yeah. Agreed.
Even the students, it's like, the first scene with like Zaina and Dami, you're like, oh, this is the classic like New York students thing where they're all yelling at the teacher and like making fun of him or whatever. And then it's like, yeah, that's a character too. That's a whole person with a whole situation that connects her to the Drew plot line. So like, I really loved that stuff. And I think that was where this pilot really grabbed me, was, the realization that I believe that's in this first episode, right? Where Kevin goes and finds out that Zaina is Drew's niece.
Yeah, I believe it's at the end of this first episode. Yeah.
I loved that because that took this from. Here's my other comparison. I watched the first 2 seasons of Donald Glover's Atlanta, and I like that show a lot. And I've been meaning to watch season 3 for months. And where the show differs is like they're both that sort of like everyone plays their performance down here, very chill. But Atlanta is like gets pretty surreal and like funny in unrealistic ways. Where on the other hand, Flatbush is like, actually real life is really funny. We don't have to do that many weird things. There's just sometimes you're just so uncomfortable that you have to laugh. Like in this first episode too, Dan is saying like, oh, this is my friend Kevin. He's like a starving artist. And Kevin says like, why do you have to say starving? Why can't I just be an artist? It's just like,
yeah.
Though, and it highlights too the way that Dan and Kevin like are both good and really, really bad for each other, because these are 2 guys who clearly don't have much in terms of like larger friend groups or people who check in on them regularly. But they care enough about each other to just, defend them to other people. And that friendship sort of like evolves, especially over the course of this first season.
Yeah. You mentioned Atlanta there, which I haven't really seen much of. And I was interested in what you had to say there, because I was trying to place this show tonally. I think if we're going to tell people should they watch this or not, it's important to give people some like reference points. And I was trying to think of shows that I've seen that this felt the most similar to. And, there are some shows like, It's Always Sunny, where like it's in a place, but like that show gets so wacky, or like Spaced, where, it's about these people who are kind of down on their luck in an apartment, but that show gets very cinematic.
Yeah.
Or like Broad City, which kind of hits some characters that are in the same zone sometimes, but that show is like more funny and like more fantastical situations. I think the show that I've seen that probably feels the most similar is like Party Down, where it's a show that never does something that couldn't happen in the real world. And it's interested in a group of characters who are so jaded, but also like really tries to love those characters through and through. And, there are times where I found it a little too serious or a little too dramatic even. But I think if people are trying to get a reference point, it feels like a show like Party Down, where it's like bleak, or like rooted to the ground. Even Party Down gets like super wacky, to be fair. But that's the sort of vibe that you're dealing with here, I would say.
Yeah, my closest reference points were the like more chill early episodes of Atlanta, Broad City to an extent, the little bit I've seen of the Hulu drama Rami, which is very, very, very similar, but more about the experience of being a young Muslim living in New York. And like, yeah, there is a genre of show like this. If you've watched one of them, you understand the vibe of it. It's funny. I used to watch Girls on HBO, which was like my big show. And the reason I don't like that show anymore, besides the fact that it aged poorly, is like it's about really privileged people feeling these problems and being like, oh, life is hard. Right. And where Flatbush Misdemeanors succeeds is over and over again, you're like, I can't realistically blame these characters for being sad. Like, they just got a really bad lot in life, and they just want the bare minimum of happiness or satisfaction with things, and they're not getting it, and that sucks, and it's not their fault. And so that makes me really come to like them, and ultimately a lot of this pilot even is like, hey, that guy who you thought was your like weird uncle, like when Kareem is introduced, he is a person too, even though he's like such a great comic relief. Like he does care, and sometimes you deal with what you have in terms of your family unit, and so they form a sort of like collective family on this series that I end up really liking. I think one last thing from the pilot that I loved, in terms of like how realistic the dialogue is when there's that fight in the school, which hilarious, like the whole like she stole my belt thing and how like difficult that gets. Dan is outside trying to like help while Jess, his boss, is like actually mediating, and over again Dan is just going, hey Jess, what can I do? Jess, hey, can I do anything? And she's like, can you just make sure these kids go to class? Like, just stop asking. You know what? Like the discomfort you feel there is like, I feel like I'm looking at my life a little bit. Please stop.
Yeah, I definitely felt kind of in the early episodes of season 1 that Dan is a character who I didn't necessarily see myself in Dan, but I saw what I'm afraid I might be like in his character, because he's so meek, and every interaction he has with students is like, hey, go to class. Oh, okay, you already left. All right. And the thing that stuck out to me is I don't know the extent to which Dan Perlman or Kevin Iso have experience as teachers, or if somebody on the writing staff does. It was hard for me to gauge, because there are like things that happen in the show where it's like, okay, you would only really think to do this sort of a joke if you either, I guess, went to a public school like this in New York City, or you taught at one. But then the show doesn't really feel that interested in the school stuff at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Which was kind of a bummer. But like the bits that stuck out to me were like that first interaction that we see Dan and Jess having, where he's like, man, these like evaluations are bullshit. Like, it's just like a popularity contest. And she's like, well, your student reviews are actually pretty positive. And he's like, yeah, I think it's just like really good that we get student feedback. that felt pretty recognizable to me.
Yeah. When it serves me, it feels great. I think it has such a fascinating relationship to these teachers, and this is something we'll talk about as soon as we expand into season 1. But just like, they are not. It fully accepts that teachers are not like perfect in any way, and that they have their own fucked up problems, and they are doing their best, and they're navigating a system that's like completely broken in some ways, and doesn't serve the interests of students or teachers all the time.
Right.
And I find the comedy that they can squeeze out of that to be really good, even though I agree it doesn't always feel like, is this real? Did you have a teacher on the writing staff, or do you just know someone who knows, like, is this secondhand? It's really tough. And part of that is because like Dan Perlman is a like stand-up comic playing a regular dude, like not playing up to a stage.
Yeah.
And so sometimes his performance can go from like really like annoyingly real, where I'm like, I know people who talk like this, where he's like, no, Zaina, come on, that kind of like, he always like sounds like when he's talking to younger people, he's like making his voice a little bit lower, and he tries to sound really like articulate when he's teaching. Like, all that stuff feels like great, but otherwise, like when he's talking to other people, I'm like, what's the character here? How do I make Dan, like, crystallize Dan in my head? He doesn't feel like they nailed down what he sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's, I have some. Dan's not my favorite character on the show. I'll say that. I think he has really funny moments, and I think Dan Perlman is great at like doing like the pathetic guy thing, which I'm certain must be a hallmark of his stand-up. Like that has to be a persona that he drops into in stand-up, I would assume.
Yeah.
Because he feels so like comfortable doing that. But yeah, like you're saying, it's not really clear to me like what matters to Dan as a character.
Right.
And
having sex with his boss.
Right. And I think I was like slightly missold on the show a little bit related to that, because I don't know. I mean, being a teacher, I was excited to see a show where like, oh, there's a character who's a teacher and that's like a thing. And
the show gets as far from that as possible after a point.
Yeah, the show gets like really invested in Kevin and being an artist, which I think is really cool. And is like super interested in Kevin's like dreams and passions and stuff like that. And with Dan, it just feels like he's a teacher, so that there can be like a setting that the show goes to and like a logical reason for these characters to be connected to each other.
Yeah.
Rather than like him wanting to be a teacher. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like the school feels like oddly vacant because you only have so much budget. You only can fill so many classrooms full of extras. And like the classes have like 15 kids in them, which is definitely not what this sort of school would look like. The basketball games have like, like, at least 25, and that would be a small class, but probably like 30 if we're talking about a public school in Flatbush. So yeah, it just doesn't, like, somebody knew stuff about schools to the extent that like they understand the bureaucracy and they understand like some things that are funny, but it seems like what we're really interested in here is we're interested in the Flatbush part, like really rendering this neighborhood, and we're interested in the misdemeanors part, like, okay, there's like kind of some shady stuff happening, or like we're really stressed out about our entanglements with characters that we don't want to be entangled with. And I think that makes for a compelling show, an interesting one, but one that ignores the things that at least I personally selfishly was hoping it would be about. But that's like a me thing, I think.
I think the truth is that there could have been a lot of value in like a show more specifically focused on being a teacher and not just like glorifying that. I think it is great that Jess and Dan are like flawed teachers, but and that even their principal is like a flawed principal. I think that's like really funny and interesting. We'll talk about the principal shortly, but like, yeah, maybe a show that was just more explicitly about that instead of like you said, like that's the setting, but really it's about X, Y, and Z. So to that point, do you want to talk about where the show goes through season 1 at least?
Yeah, let's do that. So I did not expect the show to have a continuous plot,
right.
But it does.
Big time.
Big time. Almost to the point where when I got to the end of season 2, it felt like I watched 18 and a half episodes of this today, so that take this with a grain of salt. But by the time I got to the end of season 2, it felt like I had reached the end of a really long movie, in the sense that like it is essentially a continuous story. There are some plot lines, like A plots or B plots of certain episodes that exist in isolation or that could be kind of plucked out and it wouldn't ruffle the overall plot of the show. But by and large, things follow from previous episodes. There's a previously on at the beginning of every episode, which you wouldn't normally expect for like a 30-minute New York City sitcom type of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know. What did you think about that did you know going in that this show would be like that? or if not, how did you feel when you sort of learned that it was serialized in that way?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I did not know that was coming. I
Mhm.
watched most of season 1 in 2 sittings, like on the Amtrak to and from visiting you, actually. And so I went from like, when I had watched like I think 1 through 4 on the way to you, and I got there and you're like, "Oh, do you want to like watch some?" And I kind of wanted to be like, "You can't watch what I'm watching." Like I'm like there's like a storyline brewing now about like the science lab and his parents and all this stuff. Like it's developed a plot. But if I showed you like the first 2 or 3, you could it's basically the show. What I noticed was it got more and more serialized until by like, episode 7, 8 and 10, 9 and 10 of season 1, you're like, this is all one thing. This is like so. I need every minute of this. Even I guess 7, which is lockdown, is like still sort of self-contained by design, but the things that happen in it have ripple effects through the season. And I liked that stuff. I found that like really surprisingly compelling in this first season because they found their footing. They found what the show should be about, which is the ways that capitalism and a difficult to navigate school system and like the struggles of being an artist, what those do to disadvantaged populations, like young people of color, like poor people, like people who end up dealing drugs, and what leads to those people doing that. And then at the same time saying, well, what would you do? Like when you end up wrapped up in a like drug dealing subplot, when do you run away? When do you avoid it? And what aspects of your personality kind of like leak out like that codeine bottle into your personal life and into the sort of like heavy drama plot that happens in season 1. So let's give a sort of overview of it. Basically, Kevin and Dan's relationship starts to form a rift because Kevin is helping out Drew a lot and like giving him food from his work, which eventually leads to him getting fired. We learned that Zaina, one of Dan's students, is Drew's niece, and she's staying with him because Drew essentially led to her dad going to jail for a like drug deal plot that went wrong. Something out of like a movie, honestly. Dan's mom is married to Kareem because she had a lot of mental breakdowns and also was taking a lot of pills and needed help in that time, and he was there for her. That also generationally led to Dan also developing a dependency for a while on painkillers and anti-anxiety medication, which eventually puts him into trouble. Does the big incident with that happen in this season or no? With the medication specifically.
So we basically, like, all of these things essentially escalate over the course of the season and reach a head between episodes 9 and 10. And one of the things that happens is, at the end of episode 9, Dan has a drug overdose and wakes up in the hospital in episode 10. Yeah.
And the last thing is that Dan has a crush on his boss, Jess, which eventually leads them into each other, finding vulnerabilities with each other before the show unceremoniously writes Jess off of the show by making her a bad person. They just make her, they just decide she's a bad person. And also the police are after Drew and potentially Kevin because Drew is startled by an ACS worker who comes to his home. So he shoots him. And now there's an investigation and there's a gun and oh my God, what's going to happen? That's where the season kind of wraps up. Kind of a far cry, you might say, from the wacky like teacher drama of the first couple episodes, huh?
Yes. Yeah.
You read that on paper and it said it's intense. It's a lot.
Yes. The episodes or the events of this season are pretty heavy. And the show maintains throughout all of that a pretty snappy pace. It maintains fairly witty dialogue, and it makes it easy enough, I think, to stomach a lot of what would otherwise be like upsetting sequences of events. But at the same time, it feels like you're in the midst of, I don't know, a Coen Brothers movie or something where just like terrible, complicated shit is happening to everybody. Except what if that movie was like 10 or 5 or 10 hours long? So I had mixed feelings about it, I think, because I really, really enjoyed the like slice of life nature of a lot of the first episode and some of the other parts of the season. And that's what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be a show that addresses these same themes. What is it like to live in this community? What is it like to deal with these institutions? What is it like to, fuck up and have to account for those fuck ups? What does capitalism do to us in the context of all of that? But I was expecting it to be a sort of episodic thing. And, I think this is like a post-streaming television problem.
Yeah.
That everything is just like too serialized to the point that every season has to end with like some sort of shocking thing, or everything has to come to a head. Like the moment where Drew shoots the ACS guy in the leg.
Yeah.
It's like
too much.
Yeah. Like, did we need this? Because then so much of the first part of season 2 is about characters like running around trying to deal with the aftermath of that. And that ends up being not that interesting to me. So, and then there's like just a lot of like, oh man, are they going to find out that I took this kid over or took Drew to this one student's house, or are they going to find out that Jess and I are sleeping together? Like I wasn't
Zayna here and she left the house, and
Yeah, I wasn't super interested in that because I think, it's a reality of teachers' lives that they like find themselves in unusual situations that are beyond the scope of their job. And to me, it's more interesting to like take that and examine that and sit with that, as opposed to like dramatize that as like an oh fuck moment. You know what I mean? So yeah.
Looking at my notes on season 1, I had this realization that all of the episodes that I loved that are like really memorable to me have nothing to do with an overall plot. And all of the plot lines are like the whole thing with Kevin's sister and, him trying to like get over his ex being with someone else and being
Great
like, you don't control me.
episode.
Love that episode. Love all the performances. So funny. The Lockdown episode has some like overarching plot stuff. And I definitely have problems with the like portrayal of the like bomb in the school plot line. But the gut punch of the last scene when they joke that like, so this is an episode where a former student sneaks into the school and threatens to blow people up. He doesn't actually have a bomb, it turns out. This is also coinciding with Kevin sneaking in to show off his art. And somebody says at one point, like, oh, he's white, so he's probably going to, like, get McDonald's with the cops after they arrest him, quote-unquote arrest him. And to literally show him having McDonald's with the cops, I'm like, wow, all right. You're
and then
saying
do that point of view shot from the body cam filming it.
Yes. Oh, my God. Like,
Incredible.
The audacity, the boldness. That's juice, dude. Like, that, at the time of watching, I was like, this is my favorite episode. Like, I have my issues with it, but, like, you guys went for something and you did it. More things like that. The therapist, Dan's therapist, amazing character.
Hilarious.
And that's out of the realm of reality because like the majority of therapists are not going to like tell you you're a piece of shit and laugh at you.
Right.
But like that's what makes her so funny, and the commitment to the bit of like, not only is she going to say that, but she's going to hear his upstairs neighbors yelling and be like, yo, let me fix that marital dispute real quick. They're more interesting than you. It's like the funniest thing in the world.
Yeah, so good.
And it's like two bickering lesbians, and she like helps them get better. And then she's like, thanks, Dan, put me down. Like she lives in his laptop. All of that stuff I loved. And so when we get to the like drug plot line and like Adami's family and like Zayna hiding and all that stuff, I think what kept me going through those is that I just really liked the characters. Like,
yeah, I
came to find like just a deep warmth and like love, honestly, for Zayna and for Drew especially. I think the Hassan Johnson playing Drew is like so funny and so believable as like
incredible job
as just like the person who doesn't have a filter and what doing that does for your life. And also like lacking a sort of self-control. So he is unhinged in a way, but he also runs on a set of rules that I find so interesting because he's
Yeah.
like deeply protective, deeply loyal, but he's the kind of guy that will collect the bag at the end of the day and will do anything for a quick buck. And they kind of like flanderize that later in ways we'll talk about. But I think especially in this season, I was like, I could just watch the Zaina and Drew show and like dealing with their family drama all day. And like Zaina at school with her friends and stuff. I just was like really enchanted by all of that in season 1.
Yeah. Kristen Dotson as Zaina is awesome and brings so much range and pathos to that role also. I think my favorite episode from season 1 is the one where Zaina learns that her father basically took the fall for Drew. Like he was driving Drew's car, there's marijuana in it, and he went to jail because of just the quantity of marijuana in the car. And which fucked up and systemic stuff that we can talk about. And the way that they do that episode where it's like in the present, Zaina and Drew are becoming more estranged and Drew's having a hard time tracking her down. And we flash to the past, seeing them like form that kind of, what's the word? Guardianship relationship for the first time, and how like tender and just like beautiful it is. I don't know. I thought their relationship was incredibly well rendered, and I think it was great to follow Zaina and inhabit her perspective, which is not part of how this show is advertised. I think it's really pitched as like this sort of, wacky 2 guys in a Brooklyn apartment kind of thing. And that's really just like one half of what's going on here. And then the other part of it is you're following this teenage girl living in Flatbush and coming of age in an environment that's forcing her to come of age maybe a little bit sooner than she's ready for. And she's having to navigate being independent, but also caring about her caretakers and taking care of them. And it's like a really beautiful and detailed sort of a thing. And I was so bummed that they like cut Dami out of the show, her friend, because she ends up forming this really great friendship with this girl that she's not quite on the same page with at first. But we learn about Dami's home situation. We have this really, I think, we have this really like thorough exploration of Dami's circumstances as being the child of African parents who have a certain set of expectations for her. Zaina being someone who's like not familiar with like the food that Dami eats at her house, and like her mom is Haitian and is in Haiti right now, and her dad is not Haitian. There's like just a range of kind of origins and backgrounds interacting here between these 2 young Black teenage girls who I feel like, we don't see a lot of shows that one depict that sort of a friendship between women or between Black women or between young Black women, and young Black women who have such different family circumstances and backgrounds. And that was like such a special thing, I think, that this season was able to depict, that they then kind of were like, but what if we did this other stuff that we'll talk about when we get to season 2?
Totally.
But that was the stuff that I thought was like the best of season 1 for me anyway.
I feel you there. Yeah. That episode, I think the episode you're thinking of is called Lake, which if I'm not mistaken is the Tagalog word for like father or respected person. And I'm not sure why the choice to do that. I don't know anybody who's Filipino on this show, but I could be wrong. Regardless, it's that's probably what they're going for with that title. I like the titles of the episodes. They're all usually single words. And what's brilliant is like season 1 feels like it's auditioning to you, and it's doing really creative premises and interesting things with the camera. Like Lake starts with Jess telling Dan that in college she filmed a video about a woman, like a Streets of New York sort of thing. And we learned that is that Dami's mother or is that Zaina's mother? I was confused for a sec there. when she like goes to the past and it's the woman in the dress and she's filming her.
I didn't. I thought it was just some person.
I think that ended up being one of their mothers. Because then it goes to like the daughter being like, "Oh, can I watch this show?" I think it's Zaina's mom, because at the end of the episode, Zaina is at Jess's place and she's like, "Can we watch this show on Disney Plus?" And it's like the show that the daughter was watching in the past. So I think that was Zaina's mom, continuing the theme of like everybody on the show knows each other, or the sort of idea. And I was like, that's such a creative way to do a flashback. It's like, oh, I made this movie in college and it's like so cringy, but like I always wondered what happened to that mother. And then they're like, okay, here's what happened to her: is she went on to have this daughter who's now your student. Like how life can kind of loop back around on you in interesting ways. And yeah, I definitely agree with everything you said about Zaina and Dami. And I think another aspect of how this show does well by its like young characters is it doesn't either infantilize them or treat them fully like adults. Like these are it toes that line really well, because it's really easy to say like, okay, high school kids don't know what they want, but like Zaina kind of knows what she wants, and she has the potential to be a more like secure business person than either her father or Drew eventually. And she still has her worries about boys, but she's not treated like an ignorant child who doesn't know anything about what she wants. And when she is, she pushes back, like realistically. And they come to conclusions about that. And I thought like, yeah, that's like you're saying, you just don't see it very often. And that's really sad, because this is how these relationships tend to go. I think my last big thing on season 1 was just, I mentioned the, like all the like police approaching stuff in episode 10. I was like, this is way too much. And related to that, I think that like to get them there, they really had to throw away a couple of good character dynamics. Like Jess, I mentioned earlier, we don't learn too much about what she wants until suddenly, after all of the Zaina stuff seems to be handled, she tells Dan like, I want to do something selfish for once. I don't really want to teach anymore. I'm going to go to law school and party and live my life and have fun. See ya. Yeah. And Dan's like, that's weird. Bye. And it's like, that's the part where I feel like, do you guys think that teachers are like this? That they just, sometimes they're like, I wish I wasn't teaching and I fucking hate this and I'm going to be selfish.
Yeah.
It feels a little bit mean almost to do that to her character. But I don't know how you felt about that as somebody who like has had your qualms about being a teacher, before.
Yeah, I think there's a few ways that characters are kind of unceremoniously taken out of the show that feel I don't know. I don't want to accuse the show of being sexist, because I don't think that's really fair, because there are like plenty of female characters who are pretty well like explored in it. But
to some characters it definitely is. I think that the way that they handle Jess is like kind of bad.
The way they handle Jess, the way that they handle the woman that Kevin's with, who really
she's
like yeah, she's like out on this date with this other guy, and she's like, well, I like being taken care of. I like having fancy things or going to fancy dinners, and then we like don't ever see her again. And then with Dami, who kind of doesn't exist from season 1 to season 2, and that could be like actors not wanting to come back. That could be a variety of things. But yeah, it's just strange that Jess is the kind of second character in the Kevin school plot. And it makes sense that somebody in her position who's experienced the things that she has would be like, hey, maybe it's time for me to go do something else. But, it ultimately feels like what the show is interested in is Kevin being sad that he wakes up by himself, as opposed to being interested in like, well, where does she go? What does she do with her life? And, the show's storytelling is capacious enough that it could have sent her off to law school for a little bit and she could be doing something else and then come back into the plot somehow, because the show like flings I don't want to get into season 2 too much, but by the end of season 1, we know that Kevin and Dan briefly separate, and the show is able to like kind of hold that and then bring characters back together who move away from each other. So I don't know. I thought Jess was like a character that was underdeveloped, underexplored, and I would have liked to follow her for a little more to see what happened to her.
Yeah.
But,
maybe if they
what we got of her was, Yeah, maybe if they get a season 3, she could come back. I could see that happening for sure. But yeah.
You want to talk about season 2?
Yeah, let's do that. I just want to shout out a couple kind of standout things from season 1.
Yeah.
Maria Bamford as Dan's mom.
Amazing.
So
amazing
great.
Casting.
Love that choice. Let's see.
Speaking of the empathy of the show, by the way, sorry.
Yeah.
Her love for Kareem being genuine and not a mixed race relationship like this or an interracial relationship can often be like played as a joke, or played as like something sexual exclusively. But it genuinely feels like there's a compassion there that they don't share with everyone else, but is like, well, they do actually like each other a lot. They find value in each other's lives, which I think is really cute.
Yeah, I agree. I loved the episode where they had the saxophone playing neighbor, the musician neighbor, and then he and Kevin throw eggs at the building together at the end of it.
Yep.
Such a delightful
good landlord representation. And she's like,
yes, yeah.
Do you have a second guy living in there? I'm increasing your rent, you dick. And he's like, no, he's my personal trainer. And she's like, he's wearing flip flops.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah, that stuff was all great. I think let's get to season 2 because I have some stuff that I'd love to talk about when we get there.
Yeah.
So season 2 starts not too long after season 1 left off. Maybe a couple months, I think, have gone by. Dan is living by himself in the midst of this overdose. His stepdad, Kareem, is trying to help him be clean and stay clean from pills. And this first episode is a Dan episode. He's trying to get reinstated as a teacher. He has interactions with Drew, where Drew wants him to get Zaina back in school. And I think we can also talk about the second episode of season 2 here as well, because that's the Kevin side of things. Kevin's back at home in his childhood hometown with his high school art teacher and his family. And essentially these 2 episodes are about kind of exploring what is at stake for these guys in this season. And then like, how do we get them back in the same zone since them separating at the end of season 1? What did you think about the table setting of season 2 here, and like broadly about the season in comparison to the first one?
Overall, I definitely liked season 2 less, and that comes out right away in 201 because splitting the characters up I think is great. I think they needed that both for their development and to like actually explore what Kevin's life is like. Because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, but you can really learn a lot about somebody once they aren't worrying about where they're going to live. And so Kevin being at home, you realize like, oh, here's what his, and that's not in 201, but like, I just think, to clarify, getting Kevin out temporarily was good for the show. I like that stuff a lot. This episode though really made me realize I don't think I like Dan very much, even though like I want to see him get better.
Yeah.
And I want this teacher reinstatement thing. He's just so fucking selfish and self-centered and has like no goals of any sort and feels like a nothing character that is only there to beg for things and do, embarrassing things to get what he wants. And that's like what most of this episode was for me. But the funniest thing in 201 is Drew being in hiding and wearing the wide-brimmed Yankee fitted. The funniest thing I've ever fucking seen.
Incredible hat.
11 out of 10. I need that hat.
So good. Yeah, I think season 2 is where I really was like kind of lost on the Dan character a bit. I think still Dan Perlman is doing a great job of like delivering the things that are funny, like the kind of witty or self-effacing lines. I think this character's still amusing, but I think from a narrative perspective, if you're going to do this show that is so serialized, like I have to care about this guy and understand him a little bit better. And I feel like they just didn't do a good enough job in season 1 selling me on like the drug plot line, because was this weird thing where I don't know. I really don't like, like drugs that are prescribed for anxiety or things like that being stigmatized in television, because like
Yeah.
people need those.
Mm-hmm.
Like it keeps people from seeking treatment and care and like taking a pill here and there that might just like clear their heads or make their life a little more bearable or whatever. And so I had some misgivings about just the way that like Kevin's drug habit was portrayed. Not to say that it's not realistic. I'm sure that that sort of thing has happened to people in life. But it felt like it wasn't that carefully handled, and it was sort of hand waved as like, man, this guy lives a stressful life. Being a teacher, huh? Pretty stressful. Whew, this guy is stressed out. Anyways, he's in Narcotics Anonymous now. And now the whole plot for season 2 for him is about Narcotics Anonymous. And luckily, when we get to NA, there are characters there who, like, again, the show does a really great job of showing you who they are, what they care about, what they're like, loving on those characters really deeply. And some of my kind of favorite characterful exchanges happen in the context of Narcotics Anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely, I don't know, it didn't quite land with me, being such like a big part of his character in the season. And I don't know what that comes down to, but I definitely was not that interested in it. In contrast, I think the Kevin stuff with his art and the fellowship that he eventually joins strikes an incredible balance between being character-centered, satirical, and like interesting.
Yeah. Let's, before we get to zoom that scope out, the last big thing that happens just in the start of season 2 is the reinstatement, the hearing scene, which I think speaks to where season two started to lose me, which is like every time we had stakes, we get rid of them as quickly as possible in favor of like, oh, don't you just want to see these guys hang out with each other and like everyone just talking to each other? Isn't that fun? It's like, yeah, I guess, but like you made my brother in Christ, you made the stakes, and then you get rid of your own stakes. You don't even deal with them. You're just like, things just like work magically for Dan and Kevin over and over again, where it's like, can you guys just like see, like you made problems. Why did you get rid of the problems so quickly?
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that way about the drug plot because so much of season 1, and maybe the truth is it's hard to depict this kind of drug addiction like accurately.
For sure.
But the way that they show it is like every time something dramatic happens, if you're paying attention, you just see Dan go, oh, pop a pill, oh, pop a pill. And so it sticks in the back of your head until it's a problem and you go, okay, well, the directing basically told me he was developing a drug addiction. Like, I know how this works in TV. So now we just need to, quote unquote, get rid of that problem to bring everybody back to zero, which is where I start to run into my issues. So let's zoom out our scope. Our final scope, and now we're talking about all of Flatbush Misdemeanors seasons 1 and in particular season 2, which just finished airing. So spoiler alert here. I didn't like season 2 of this show very much. Not much at all. And I was bummed because I felt like the characters are all, everyone like finally perfected how to play their characters, and they're given very little that's like interesting to see. Outside of Kevin at home in episode 2, yes, Drew, Zaina's dad. I think some of the Zaina plotline stuff gets a little ridiculous. And to me, they didn't build up to the conflict in this season. Instead, they simply introduced it in Boiling Point. And they were like, all right, it's been there the whole time. Here you go. Everything's happening now. Go. Fine. Final episode. And it's like, you didn't set this up in any meaningful way. Why are we getting here? Maybe you disagree. I'm willing to hear that argument, but I felt that a lot of season 2 was sort of like flanderizing these really realistic characters and making them into cartoons, and that's where it lost me a little bit.
Yeah, I think I think season 2 moves away from the complete groundedness a bit. for better and for worse, because I think the like funniest stuff in season 2 has to do with Kevin's fellowship, which is called the No Negro Left Behind Fellowship, which is absurd. And like the white people who run it are these caricatures of, like woke white people that are very, very funny and cringy and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So like that's great. The comedy of that is great. I think we see more moments of Drew interacting with different characters, and we get more of Drew's interiority, which is cool. Even if it's like a little ridiculous for him to show up in the places that he shows up in the season. But yeah, like you're saying, it also just, I don't know, feels a little bit more up in the air. And I think it really is the kind of post-streaming problem of the show just gets a little too caught up in its plot. And, it doesn't need to do that. It can afford to be more slice of life. Like, you don't need to have
the scene where Sydney, for example, we learned that Drew sold her drugs. That's like the inciting incident of the season. And it's like, I literally didn't need it, guys. You didn't need to you're trying to do the Dan thing again, but with Sydney, his new friend from NA, and I'm not feeling it. I was like not in favor of that whatsoever.
Yeah. Like it's just, I don't know. The show like makes a lot of swerves and choices to make something bad happen at times where obviously you want to depict that kind of stuff because it happens in people's lives. And I think there are moments where it works for me. I think when bad things happen around Zaina, I think it works because the show has kind of like set that expectation that she's growing up in an environment where there's going to be unexpected bad things that happen and she has to figure out how to navigate that. But the thing that's like strange about Flatbush Misdemeanors is it's like these two shows. It's the sort of like two best friends 20-something guys sitcom with Dan and Kevin. He's a teacher, he's a painter, will they ever get along? And then it's like this really heartfelt depiction of Zaina and her uncle moving through a complicated world and trying to figure it out. And then those shows knock against each other on an episode, like a frequent basis. And the characters in like the two friends sitcom get super stressed out that this like real life show is bumping against them. And then Zaina and her uncle get like, you're saying, flanderized or a little wacky when this sitcom knocks against their show.
It's two different things. That's a good point.
And I think you can hold both of those things and have a show that does it. And I think season 2 falters a little bit in like trying to square all of those elements. But I respect the attempt because, I wouldn't want to watch a show that was just the Kevin Dan stuff. Maybe I would watch a show that's just Zaina and Drew. I would watch that show.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that the Kevin Dan show is like, yeah, we want to look at like these teens and this guy who's like not the 20-something, like the age or demographic of the people who are watching the show, not the life experience of the people who are watching the show, probably. So, I respect what they're doing here. And overall, I'm glad this show exists. I'm glad I watched it. I had a really good time. I was really entertained.
I laughed a lot. Memorable characters.
Yeah, it was really funny. But narratively, there's some stuff that isn't perfect.
Who's our favorite new side character in season 2? 3, 2, 1. Franklin. That's correct.
Yes. Yeah, his Dan's sponsor at Narcotics Anonymous.
God tier character. Oh my heavens. Love the guy.
Well, the thing that's so great about him is the thing that's great about the therapist. It's the thing that's great about Kevin's boss at the restaurant. It's the thing that's great about all these characters, which is when there's a moment where you're like, okay, I get it. I get like the shtick or the sketch character that they are. The character will then say like, no, motherfucker, I'm a human being.
Yes.
Like, listen to me for a second.
Dude.
And that stuff is awesome. And it happens over and over again throughout the show that a character who you expect to just be this kind of throwaway character comes back for another scene later, and they're like, let me explain to you why I am the way I am and want the things I want and do the things I do.
And why you, Dan/Kevin, and you, the viewer, thinking that I was one note is actually really ignorant. Like, pointing the finger at you. Because Franklin initially is like, oh my God, this guy just like tells stories and he's so annoying and he like doesn't listen to me. And he's like, I tell stories because you're not a good listener, right? And I like have life experience that's useful to you, even though you don't want to take it because you're up your own ass. He's like the only character to tell Dan that. And then Dan's like, oh, you are a good sponsor. So I think like the NA plot, I'm turning around on it more because I just disliked the way that they handled Sydney at the end. But I think it does good to like kind of lampoon Dan's character a little bit and be like, hey, we're making fun of you. You're not the nicest guy here.
And I think honestly, if it had started, like if you were dropped into this show and it's like, hey, here's Dan, he's a teacher and he's also a narcotics addict, right?
Yes.
Like I would be like, okay, that works for me. I get that. I understand it. I think the thing that was not working for me is watching the ramp into that state of affairs and like not being totally brought along for every step of that. But then once we're there, it works. I think the situations are funny. I think the characters are good. But it's just the plotting of it is like not quite right.
Yeah. I actually like the actress who played Sydney. Dan's sort of like on and off again fling, I guess, good friend in NA, who he almost sleeps with before nearly burning his apartment down. Hilarious. We've all been there. No. Except I just think that it really felt like it was out of nowhere when she suddenly started acting weird. And then an episode later, she's like, and then Drew's like, I sold her narcotics. I sold a drug addict narcotics. And he tries to explain himself about, like, I didn't know that she was going to abuse them. It's not my fault that she did that. But, like, seriously, Drew, you are in NA and you sold narcotics to a narcotics addict. You thought that was going to be fine for you. Interesting. Just, like, that's where I'm like, you guys kind of, like, invented a plot. Like, you invented a thing to create tension. But then they get rid of it really quickly. And they just kind of get past it. And so earlier you mentioned how like the Zaina Drew stuff doesn't connect to the Kevin and Dan stuff too much. And I think that's why the final scene, or one of the final scenes, which is in episode 10, in the bike shop where they like see each other, was so funny to me. Because it finally felt like the two plots were like, huh, that's what you've been doing for 10 episodes? What? You're dealing with like your boyfriend who's working with Drew and you live on your own now? And then she's like, yeah, well, you're in Narcotics Anonymous and you guys have been holding on to this bag of lean for like 5 episodes. And they're just like, this all sucks. Everybody go home. Stop doing any of this. And they just kind of like I mutually agree that like this story will only get sadder if we keep leaning into it. Let's divest and go home. I really liked that. And my other thing I loved about the Zaina plot was the introduction of her dad and actually getting to see Anthony be in the show. I'm pretty sure he's like a well-known rapper that they had to play Anthony, which is like interesting casting.
Anthony's her dad.
Yes, the one who gets out of who gets out of jail. Because of course when she says like, why do you think that this parole hearing is going to go any differently? And he's like, because it's not the same as the other ones. And of course it's the one when he gets out. Like convenience. My last big thing in season 2, let's just like zoom in a little teensy bit more on
Sticky Fingers.
Sticky Fingers is yes, that's correct. On the Fellowship plot, because it feels like somebody watched Sorry to Bother You and was like, let's lean way further into how uncomfortable that made you feel. Like the way that white people wield blackness and the African American experience like a serrated edge and are able to do that. This whole plot felt on the level of season 1's Lockdown, where it's like, oh, you guys know that like this only works because people like Nancy exist all over New York. All over New York, DIY spaces are converted into weird things like this, where the promise of stable living and potential financial compensation is offered, and what you're giving away is your integrity and your work and your time and energy and your labor. So he's basically like making them work and then saying you might get paid. It's like deeply dark, but what makes it funny is this character of Nancy who like starts as that one white woman everybody knows and then ends with kissing a picture of a black man that she has in the office and then whispering to it. Like that's an example where like she's gonna get ridiculous, and then when she does, it's like, yes, this feels correct to me. So much good comedy around her.
And it's, again, in a show that offers so much empathy and care to so many people, it makes it even funnier when the show chooses to be like, yeah, no.
Nancy just sucks. That's fine.
Not this lady. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we don't need to hear about her. We get all of these like different art students and their conflicting views on like art and creation, and like Kevin's idol is there, and she's like, oh, you do work just for a paycheck, but at the end of the day, you need to take care of yourself. That doesn't mean you're a sellout. I loved all of that stuff, and just to have the comedy of Nancy hovering over all of that was like a beautiful blending of the serious and the comedic.
Yeah,
in this season. So shout outs to the actress playing Nancy. That was me, honestly, a really weird role to play. Like, you're just gonna play the most annoying racist white woman ever. You're actually gonna put on makeup and play the drums in front of these like black students. So good luck, have fun. Interesting role to take. And then even like little subtle jokes like Drew, as part of his parole, has to try and get a job, and he keeps trying to get a fake job. So Dan like tries to help him with his resume, and God, I fucking died. This is like the funniest thing in season 2 to me. He gets a Zoom interview with some like fake ass like startup company, and the guy loves him and is like eating up all of his bullshit that he faked on his resume. And then he's like, you know what? You're overqualified for this boring administrative job. We want you to be head of diversity at our startup, which probably pays like way too much money. And he's like, it's just your standard 60 hours a week. And Drew closes the laptop. He's like, no. And then tells Dan like it didn't work. I'm like, I died. That was so good.
Yeah, pretty funny.
When this show has an edge to it, it's the best. That's the show at its best.
Yeah.
But it's when it just tries to like waffle around and do silly things and doesn't move anything forward, I'm like, either do this or do that. You can't do both. So the season ends with like a nice, everybody seems to be doing okay. Zaina and her father are going to move into Flatbush together, and Dan and Kevin are friends again. There's two really good poetic images in this show that I wanted to bring up. In season 1, when Dan is trying to impress Jess, he gets her a cactus for her birthday because he thinks it's easy to take care of because it's low maintenance. And there was a moment when I realized the poetry of Dan walking and like ignoring all the problems in his life to bring this cactus to her. And I realized that Dan was the cactus, because Dan is low maintenance and Dan is like a people pleaser, and he's good enough, but he's not interesting. And so it's so funny to me that Jess is like, oh, I don't even like cacti. And he's like, oh, I could change. Like, they like know what they're doing. And the final image of season 2 being Dan brings to Kevin, he's like, oh, Kareem couldn't, I left the job, but he couldn't pay me, so he gave me this bike. Bike has no brakes. Still, like, all I can do is pull it around. All I have is the burden. I don't have the momentum anymore. That's like Dan and Kevin at the end of the season, is they are bikes with no brakes. I was like, oh, this is beautiful. This is like the sauce I'm looking for. So it gets there, but we've talked a lot about the show, what we liked, what we didn't like. Are there any other big things that you wanted to shout out, especially in season 2?
I wanted to see way more of like the high school theater production, the rehearsals, and like the ways that the kids and their teacher were shifting and recontextualizing this play. I was like, that's cool.
The non-binary teacher who's like telling them about the play.
Yeah.
Sick. Love it.
Awesome. Yeah, that was all great.
That needed a full episode. I wanted to see the play also. Anyways.
Yeah. Fun fact, by the way, I looked this up. The high school is not a real high school as far as I could tell, but it's named after a real person, Beaufort Delaney, who was an African American modernist painter during the Harlem Renaissance, which is just like a cool, I don't know, just like a cool choice and a subtle sort of reward if you know who that is or if you Googled it. And it's like, oh, okay. It's like related to what's going on in the show. That's cool.
Yeah.
I love it.
He was friends with James Baldwin.
There you go. But yeah, overall, I think season 2, I guess we haven't at any point formally said if you should watch the show or not. So maybe we can do that now.
Yeah, let's do the breakdown. I was going to say.
I would say like the stuff that really made me fall in love with it at the outset was like the Brooklyn stuff. And so it's hard for me to know if somebody who like has never been to these parts of Brooklyn would like it in the same way or not, at least on first encounter. But I think if you stick with the show, you'll be really enamored by how much it cares about people. And that's just like charming. I think the show is kind of dark. It styles itself as a raw comedy. That's like how it's described on IMDb anyway. And I think that's probably how the creators want to describe it. And so, you know, your mileage may vary when it comes to that sort of tone. But even in season 2, which I think maybe wasn't as strong, I still really enjoyed the show. And I watched 9 straight hours of it today, and I didn't get sick of it. So, you know, I think that says something.
There are shows when you do that, I'm like we were talking about what we're going to watch next month, and I was like, I don't think you should watch all of that in a day. But like, this is a show you can totally shotgun all 20 episodes of in a day if you feel like it. And I think you'll know from the first like 2 or 3 if you want to commit. And at that point, you might as well, because season 2 ends well and ends in a way that I'm like, I don't actually think we need a season 3. I think everybody is doing
it feels
fine.
like an ending. Yeah.
Yes. So that's a concern always with the should you watch is like, hey, does this show end? And I think it does. And, you know, I'm really glad we covered a show that's not as out there. Like most of the people I told about this were like, oh, I've never heard of that. I have no idea who any of these people are. And like, I want to be able to uplift shows like this that are like cast and crew, primarily people of color. It's like actually about what it's like living in Brooklyn, and it's how people there talk. This is a really, from what my understanding, is a pretty accurate depiction of how some people talk there. And while it's a depiction of teaching may not always be spot on, it's really funny. It's got characters that you're going to want to quote all the time, and it's charming as hell. It's kind of like a go-getter show. It's like, wow, I'm really impressed that you guys made so much with so little. Because it's still even in the end of season 2, I'm like, they don't have that many sets. Their budget clearly can't be that high. Even though it's Showtime, it's like they probably just got the 2-season order and they did it. And it started and finished, and that's great. Yeah. Not every show has to be part of a mega franchise, you know?
Yeah.
I think Flatbush Misdemeanors gets a solid, you know, if you'll know if you want to watch all of it, you should at least check out the pilot and get a sense for the vibe, and you'll get the sense from there. Yeah. So that's what we got this month for Should You Watch. We hope that you found this educational and informative in helping you call your watch queue. As we mentioned, Flatbush Misdemeanors is on Showtime, so it's another hurdle. It's always worth mentioning is yet another streaming service. Is it worth getting Showtime for this show? I don't think so. Yeah, probably not. The Showtime mobile app also is really annoying. Yes. At least on Android. The one on Android is not very good. The PS5 app is fine. It's sufficient, but it also forgets what episode I'm on. I'll be on 207 and it'll start playing 107, which is really weird. I always was like, oh, I guess they're doing a throwback in this recap. I'm like, no, I'm watching the wrong episode. That happens to me like 4 times. The thing that happened to me is whenever I would switch out of the app in the middle of playing the episode and come back to it, it would then play the audio. Like there would be the audio would play, and then there'd be like a half second or a second long delayed version of the audio playing right after it. Oh. And I'd have to like close the episode and reopen it every time I switched out of the app. That or the episode would crash and I would have to just play it again. The mobile app is not good for Showtime. I think if you get Showtime for Yellow Jackets, you still have your month free or whatever. check out Flatbush Misdemeanors. See if you want to watch all of it. It's breezy.
Yeah.
It's not too much.
Yeah.
John, do you want to tell the folks what we're watching next month for Should You Watch?
Sure. So we're going to do something a little new and different for us for Should You Watch. And we're actually going to watch 2 shows over the course of the next 2 months. So at the end of September, we'll check in on these 2 shows, which will both be a little over halfway done. And then by the end of October, we'll talk about them in their entirety. And those 2 shows, you've probably heard of them. They are pretty big installments in major fantasy franchises. The first is The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, the Amazon show.
Prequel to the Lord of the Rings books and movies.
Correct. And then House of the Dragon, which is a prequel to Game of Thrones. So we'll be watching everything that we've seen so far of those by the end of September next month. And then by the end of October, we'll have watched the whole shows.
Dope.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's coming from Game of Thrones wise. Somebody I have watched and read all of it. Magellan has watched some of it.
Some of it, yeah.
So you'll get that perspective. And then Lord of the Rings, we're both like fair weather fans, I would say. I like the movies. I haven't watched them in so long. And the show's got some things going on. So that's your perspective you're coming from. So Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power on Amazon Prime. House of the Dragon on HBO Max. Check them out. We'll be talking about them next month for Should You Watch. And we'll let you know if they're worth your time.
Yeah.
With that, I can bring us quickly to our plug zone, if you don't mind.
Please do.
We gotta pay the bills here at Should You Watch Studios. I want to say, by the way, we've been uploading Should You Watch to YouTube every month because it's sort of our big flagship like news show, and it's been performing super well. If you discovered Should You Watch through YouTube, give the Chatz channel a subscription, please, and also consider subscribing to the main podcast feed, Chatz, a television podcast, where we do a TV book club every week. So that's my plug there. That shout outs to the YouTube fan base. If you would like to get in contact with us, our email address is chatspod@gmail.com. That's CHATZPOD. Our Twitter is @chatspod, and our subreddit is r/chatspod. If you like the podcast, again, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Rate us on your podcast platform of choice, however you think we are worth. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. We have a website, which is chatspod.com. And most importantly to us, we have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/chatspod. And you can get all sorts of cool goodies over there by subscribing at $1, $3, or $5 a month. If you're a $5 patron every month there, you get all sorts of bonus stuff, like I said. And you also get thanked at the end of every main episode of the feed. As of today, our $5 patrons include Arthur, Jen, Kat, Lee, Magellan's mom, Marcus, Marin, Michael, Nick and Pat of the Brothers at Infinite War, Fendon, Six, and Stefan. Thank you so much for supporting Chats. We really appreciate you in all forms of your being. That's what we have, folks. John, am I forgetting anything? Is that how do we get out of this?
No, that's it. You did it all.
Thank you so much for Magellan. Thank you so much to Magellan for being the Dan to my Frank. I don't want to be Jess because I feel weird about that. I don't want to be Kevin because I feel weird about that. You have to be Dan legally, though. Ooh, thank you. Well, none of these work. There's so much.
You can be Franklin to my Dan.
Franklin, sorry, not Frank. I'll be the Franklin to your Dan. And thank you guys for listening to Should You Watch, where you should be watching.